conversation stage. I hope you've had a good break and you are ready for an afternoon of action and ideas. So I'm going to be your host here for the next session on the future of cities. And I think we're going to be in for a really good debate. I mean, I feel like I've been talking about the future of cities for ages, but especially now, as we've heard from some of the other sessions, we are at a bit of an inflection point where sort of AI is gathering speed and gathering steam, and it is beginning to change the urban architecture. So please welcome on stage our panelists. Panelists, please, to the stage. Thank you. So you can see we've got the panelists here. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then that's going to give way to then another session of kind of short, I wouldn't even say talks, I've called them provocations, just so that we get an idea of where each panelist stands, what they're thinking about currently, what they think are the big ideas, what are they interested in, and then that's going to kind of lead on to a panel debate. We're also obviously going to have time for Q&A, so please put your questions in Slido, and we'll take some of those. Some of those might come up in the conversation as well. So without further ado, can I ask, actually, starting with you, Jeremy, can you just say who you are, where you're from, and why you're on this panel and interested in the future of cities?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Morley. I'm the Chief Geospatial Scientist at Ordnance Survey, the national mapping agency for Great Britain. We do a lot in the geospatial realm around cities and city systems of one sort or another, and AI. And I should say I'm neither Kersten nor connected with Bradford. I'm standing in today, so thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. Kirsten sends her apologies. She can't come. A slight schedule change, which I should have mentioned. Thank you, Jeremy. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Birkin. I'm the Programme Director for Urban Analytics at the Alan Turing Institute. So I guess I'm one of a group of people at the Turing who have a major interest in the future of cities and regions and the relevance of AI and data science to all of that.
Oh, Malka.
My name is Malka Older. I'm the author of the science fiction political thriller Infomocracy, which I think is why I'm here. But I'm also a disaster sociologist at Arizona State University.
Hello everybody, I'm Tariq Khan. I am Chief Digital and Information Officer at the London Borough of Camden, which covers some of the key areas within central London, from Covent Garden all the way up to Highgate and Hampstead.
Brilliant. So we're going to start with our provocations, and this was very open-ended when we were planning it, because there is so much to say about the future of cities. But we decided that we would start with Tariq as someone who is actually now working literally on the ground in cities, and then kind of gradually zoom out. So Tariq, I was going to say your 2 minutes starts now. But
no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. But would you like to share your thoughts, your provocation with us, please?
Sure. So I feel that as the use of AI and its applications is gathering pace, a lot of people are talking about participatory and inclusive approaches to this, in bringing in the communities. However, I feel that not enough work at this point has been done around how that actually happens. When you think about what the anatomy of a good explanation is, you need to talk about causation, which is if you do X and Y, it equals Z. You need to talk about context, and you need to talk about human motivations as well. When you overlay that on top of the fact that you're working in local government or national government, when you're looking at the type of people that are participating with public sector at the moment, they're normally people from a specific socio-economic bracket. We have issues around digital divide and digital inclusion. How are we creating these participatory and inclusive approaches? There's lots of difficulty there, and it's something that we're trying to address at London Borough of Camden, but it's not an easy task.
Thank you. Jeremy.
So thinking about this, I had my immediate reaction was kind of what cities where, really, and I think maybe our focus here will come a lot to Western cities in the UK and so on, but there's a big difference. In this country, I think you could say that probably most of our cities that are going to be built have been built already, and there is infrastructure there already. If you look at other nations, maybe there's a rapidly industrializing, throwing up cities, there's a different opportunity there versus developing nations that are still on the start of that growth trend. So the future of which cities is quite important in considering how this kind of technology affects things. And then are we just interested in the technology or how development happens around the world? And then I think an elephant in the room is also then the effects of climate change and prevention and mitigation and what that will do to our cities in the next few years as an overlay on top of what the technology is doing as well. We're going to have to be adapting and mitigating in the next years. So that then relates to the scale of ambition around things like decarbonisation and what are we doing in our cities around decarbonisation. There may be easier things like transport, and then there are difficult things like the urban fabric. How are we heating and ventilating our buildings, including all those residential buildings? So all of that is part of that. And I think even if we just think of the kind of glorious technology future, there could be a lot of change here. The coming of autonomous systems, particularly vehicles and autonomous mobility, might allow us to change the structure of our cities quite a bit as well. Drones, microgeneration, there's quite a lot of technology coming that will affect how we could use our cities and how we get about them as well.
It reminds me of in the previous session we had somebody mentioning coffee drones, which I thought I'd like to live in that city. Mark.
Okay, so I've actually brought two props with me, and I don't know if you can see this in the room or online. So one of them is a camera here, and the other one is a book. So the camera, if you can see it, is quite a chunky camera, but as of about 2 weeks ago, it's no longer my main camera. So my other camera is about twice the size of this. It weighs about the same. It has 34.5 million pixels in its sensor, I think, and it can pick up through some kind of artificial intelligence the movement of people. It can recognize faces. It can recognize eyes. It's a fantastic piece of technology, and it's currently my most favorite thing. So the book is something that I was involved in writing about 25 years ago, and it's called Intelligent GIS, Location Decisions and Strategic Planning. And in the book, we talked about a lot of exciting applications of data analytics, modeling, simulations, work that we were involved with corporate organizations, Ford we work with around the world on market analysis, strategy, consumer analytics, but also some other kinds of applications to healthcare, to planning water consumption, to urban planning. Now, if you've had the chance to go to any of the exhibition on level 3, which I'd really encourage you to do, you can see some fantastic applications of the way that people have taken on some of these ideas. We have some things there in relation to planning around mobility, around land use planning, some really great stuff. Having said that, I actually don't really know where we were with photographic technology 25 years ago. This is a bit of a late life kind of thing for me. But basically, I think that those kind of technologies I'm referring to with the cameras have really come on, leaps and bounds fantastically in the last 10 or 15 years. And I feel that if we were able to make similar leaps in progress in relation to AI, in relation to data science, then these big challenges, creating green and net zero and sustainable cities of the future, being able to respond effectively to pandemics, to economic shocks, and living up to those, what was in the Turing strategy this morning, I should know this off pat, but building better cities, better regions, better societies for all of us, that's in reach, but we need to get these similar leaps in progress, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Malka.
When I think about what's fundamental about cities as entities that are different from everything else, I'm thinking about scale, I'm thinking about density, and I'm thinking about space. When I think about scale, we're seeing that right now, this is a process that's happening on all sorts of different levels of our government of trying to decide what is the right scale or level of jurisdiction for deciding different things. We see this with nation states, with supranational organizations like the European Union and ASEAN. We see this going on with federations. We see this with regions and subregions. We see it in cities too, as we think about megacities, as we think about dividing cities into boroughs, going right down to the micro scale of neighborhoods, and also accumulating in conglomerates that are more enormous than anything that has existed in the world before. So I'm thinking about scale and figuring out how technology lets us both get down to that micro level and accumulate data from very, very large numbers of people to deal with the needs. I'm thinking about density because what's exciting about cities is density, is having a lot of people, a lot of ideas, a lot of art, a lot of food, a lot of events, a lot of interests going on in a small space. This allows for serendipity, it allows for diversity. It's the exciting part that makes people want to live in cities. But density without some space to it doesn't really allow those things to happen. If you think about density as just enormous rows of identical tower blocks with no places for people to come together, then you don't get those interactions that are so vital. And space means physical space, like areas of community, but also leisure time, also the space that people have temporally to meet. And that space means also space that is not programmed. That means open areas in cities that are not pre-decided for something to happen there, but that allow for spontaneity and serendipity. So I'm thinking about all those things and how they can be reflected in the digital as well as the physical worlds. And then very briefly, to put on my disaster sociologist jacket, I also need to say that one of the issues with density and spontaneity is that disasters are much more complicated to deal with in cities because of this, this conglomeration of people and different ideas and different needs. And so for all the strength, all the value that we get from diversity and density, we also need to think about the problems that come along with having massive accumulation of sewage in one place, having massive numbers of people when you need to evacuate a place suddenly for some reason. So I'm just gonna add that as the sort of flip side of worrying about the contingencies of what to do with cities when something happens.
Brilliant, so thank you. Those are really good introductions to what is obviously going to be, it can be an amorphously huge subject. So I'm gonna rein it in a bit and just ask you sort of on the fundamental side, and maybe I'll start with you, Tarek, because you are on the ground, as I said, at Camden, which is where I happen to live. So, so that's interesting, given the problems I have with your website. But so, do you think that the use of AI and data science in urban settings is about helping us to live? Basically just kind of finessing or fine-tuning the way we live to make it more efficient? Or do you think it should be about fundamentally changing the way that we live and the way we interact with our environment?
I think the function of technology and data is always as an enabler more than anything else. It's always something that helps us as human beings deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. So I always say that when we talk about the cities of the future, my aspiration is that they look like some of the cities of the past, where we had town halls, we had we got bakeries, libraries, places that weren't developed for cars but for humans, and developed for the needs of human beings. And so in Camden, we're starting to develop certain spaces like that with Coldstrop Yard. And if any of you guys have been around King's Cross, you'll see some of the new, more progressive urban spaces that we're creating. But I do think there's a role for technology there and AI. The way that I see it eventually getting to where it will eventually get to, my aspiration is that it almost works in the background. And it works as, like, if you think of a city as an organism, AI and data can be almost like the central nervous system of that organism, regulating, giving you a temperature of what's going on, allowing a city to work symbiotically with nature, being able to be using some of these technologies to incorporate some of these inclusionary and participatory practices that I was talking about. So really enhancing some of the aspirations that we've got as a human race rather than kind of being a form of hard power, as it were. I want to open it up to the panel. I mean, do you think that idea of AI and data science as an enabler, that isn't what many of us think about when we visualize the city of the future? We almost, we think about very futuristic, almost sci-fi things where we live the technological life.
I think an interesting component of this is kind of the technocratic view versus how it relates to kind of sociopolitics and so on. And a thing that floats around at the moment is the idea of the 15-minute city and the ideas of walkability and services being within an area. If you look at some of the dialogue of that and at some political extremes, it's a really interesting pushbacks of what you're going to say. We can't go outside our 15-minute zones, that there'll be checkpoints to make sure your cars don't go outside of that, And so part of this is about how some of this technology enables dialogue as well, and there are clearly risks about that as well, as we heard in the opening session yesterday. So how does this participation happen, and how does this technology interface between some of this technocratic view and the socio-political system is a really important interface.
And a really interesting case study there is the Google Sidewalk stuff that they did in Toronto, where there was a lot talked about how that participation worked.
Did it work?
No. There was lots of learnings. I mean, that's a very kind of binary answer, but there's a lot of subtext to it. But there was, like you were saying, a lot of interpretations. It comes back to when I was talking about the participatory nature. You are starting on a bit of a back foot with AI. There is a general consensus that it's the robot overlords taking over the world kind of thing. So you do have to have that rich dialogue.
And as Mark mentioned, planning is an important part of this. And what's the future for planning in this country, and how does that digitalise and keep up with kind of all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to pick up on that, because I think, we talk about technocracy and that kind of thing, and I think technology is in danger of having a bit of a bad press in this context. I immediately think of there's kind of the bottom up kind of stuff and the top down, and I'm still in the last century, I think, as far as kind of social media and mobile phones and that kind of thing is concerned. My car keeps telling me to switch the phone on, kind of thing, because I saw it once. It's like, mind your own business. I don't want to know about that. But then we talk about technology in rather negative ways sometimes, and I think we need to be much more positive about it. I think about something like Uber or the rideshare companies, bridging that gap, where they've been very effective in adapting the technology, to create very successful business models, to move people around cities and so on and so forth. But and I feel that we come back to the planners, the authorities. We're missing a trick in allowing all that kind of thing, to get commercialised. There's a real opportunity there, and I think we need to find a way, get hold of it. We can't just allow all that technology to get commercialised and used for corporate gain rather than more social objectives.
And Malka, I want to bring you in, because I think that exactly when I hear about when we talk about enabling and being able to do things efficiently, it makes me think about where the power will lie in a future city, because at the moment we have such a thing as democracy. But actually, I think part of the pushback we've had in AI is the fact that we don't actually feel like we have that control and autonomy and agency. Malka?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that there's a really important parallel to draw between the idea of having human-centered cities and cities that we plan and guide as they develop organically around the idea of being nice places to live. And thinking about how AI develops and making sure that it is also human-centered and focused on solving actual problems as opposed to showing off how clever it is or finding problems to show the solution that was already invented because someone thought it would be cool. And I am a science fiction author. I'm very in favor of cool things. But I also think that as we are prioritizing where we develop, how we deploy it, we need to really be thinking about what it is doing for our lives. And so I agree very much that AI and technology should be enabling, that there may be some points where we can find, this is a way to change life for the better, but it should be looking at whose lives we're changing, what we mean by better, as opposed to just saying, flying cars, what a great idea. We were promised those in movies 50 years ago, so now we should have them. No, we need to really be thinking about what the benefit is and who it goes to, as well as who it harms.
In my kind of science fictional touch point from way back at the foundation books by Isaac Asimov, which were really interesting, inventing a theory of psychohistory that could predict the trajectory of civilizations for centuries to come, and using that to guide civilizations through anarchy and so on. Except, it's also an extremely kind of paternalistic and we know best kind of view of development of the world. And that really reflects some of this discussion, I think, of who has the power and how do people participate in that decision making. Mm-hmm. And what is the level of access you need as a citizen to understand all this technology that's going on, to be able to enter into that dialogue well, I think. Part of that.
So one of the things we've been trying to do at Camden is we've worked in conjunction with the Alan Turing Institute to develop a data charter. So we've brought a cross-section of our community, and we've worked over a number of weekends, and we've worked with Alan Turing experts, our own data experts, and spent a meticulous amount of time explaining data concepts, explaining case studies. And actually, what we were surprised by was that whilst there is initial reticence around some of these technologies, once we've taken time to explain it and actually talk about our motivations and be transparent, it's incredibly encouraging. And they have become vocal advocates for some of the stuff that we're trying to do. The difficulty is always, that we're lucky because we're a local government, so we've got that relationship with our community a little bit more, and we're able to have some of those one-to-one communications. The difficulty happens when you scale it out at a national or a global level.
But also you've got that, and I know this because, as I say, that's where I live, the digital divide, which you referred to. So in the pandemic, for example, a lot of the kids at my son's comprehensive didn't have laptops, could not learn. So one of the things that people like me did was when I got asked to give a lot of talks during the pandemic, and actually the money went to the laptop fund. Yeah. So how do you square the fact that you want everyone to be part of this digital thing, but there is so much inequality, so much, when you think about income, not only income actually, but also age. Because one of the things I've worried about is older people being locked out. Yep. And again, from my own personal experience, my mother's 85. I've just given her her first smartphone, and she has resisted. And I've said, look, Mum, you're just not going to be able to access things. So how do you sort of run towards the city of the future while not leaving people behind?
Absolutely. So it's one of those, it's something that we found over the pandemic, that the people that it exacerbated the problems that we knew were already there. So the people that were already isolated became even more isolated because they didn't have access to technology, they didn't know about it. So digital inclusion is very high on the agenda. And to give you an example, like we talk about Camden, so Google's next door, Facebook's down the road, we've got Alan Turing Institute, all these big organizations. You can walk about 7 minutes and you can go to one of the estates that's one of the poorest estates in the whole of Europe. So there's sitting right next door to each other these huge inequities, and that's one of the things that we're trying to address. Short answer to your question is, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and we're trying to. So I've just sponsored a digital our council is trying to work on identifying the problem, understanding the different groups that are there. Digital inclusion. There's people where English isn't their first language. There's old. there's young, like you were saying. I heard stories of people in the pandemic, actually, because they couldn't get a contract for broadband, they were having to do their kids' classes through prepaid credits. It was costing them £35 a day just for their kids to have a lesson, and this is it had developed. So there's all of these challenges, and it's like you say, you're racing ahead, but what you don't want to go is further away from the future, further away from that divide. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know the answer to it, but it's something that is what's built in the provocation that I was talking about.
I mean, I think it might sound a bit dumb, but I think you can make progress by at least thinking about getting out there. Again, one of the examples that we have on display here is like a low traffic neighborhood intervention tool. So thinking about how can we design solutions that help people in all kinds of communities to address problems of kind of antisocial motoring behavior and those sorts of problems. And one of the things that group did, it's a very nice computational implementation, but what you can also do is you can turn it into a game, you can put it on a big flat board, and they took this out to to community groups in Bristol. Actually got people coming in, I say kind of gamifying a bit. Maybe that doesn't necessarily reach your elderly community, but maybe reaches people with different kinds of interests. So don't always go through the the smartphone, the internet, the kind of stuff that we take for granted. I think you can mix it up a bit and find other things that work.
Malka.
Yeah, I also want to challenge a little bit this idea that going towards the city of the future is in tension with including everyone, because I think all of us have these ideas of what the future should look like that are largely based on science fiction from whenever we grew up. Whether we're thinking about Star Trek or Back to the Future, or I'm dating myself here, but some more recent
Hunger Games.
things. There you go. And I think, the city of the future is whatever we decide to build. So if we start picturing the city of the future as a city that is inclusive, that has lots of different modalities of communication for what different people need, lots of different ways of transportation for what different people have need for, that has different kinds of community for the people who need to be out and meet people a lot, and also ways for people who need to be inside to communicate and have community. I think then we are imagining something very different that doesn't have this dichotomy between technology and equality or inclusiveness.
And I'm thinking of Mark's point about planning, because when you talk about building the cities of the future, I'm thinking, well, who will be building them? But I want to pick up again on the, I'll just move slightly, because Jeremy made the point, very important point actually, is that kind of we have these ideas kind of ticking over, we're doing this in our cities, X, Y, Z, but actually we do have to move fast in terms of climate mitigation, in terms of water scarcity and so on, the efficiency, I suppose, if you like, but also protecting against the threats of the future, maybe pandemic planning. How do we do that?
There are lots of different scale challenges to that, I think, because yes, some of that is at kind of utility and national planning levels, about kind of water supply across the nation is going to need a kind of national solution to it, because where the rain is falling, maybe not where it's needed, and so on. So some of that is outside of the strict purview of say, one local authority. And then I think there are just lots of scale issues with this. There is, are you interested in neighborhoods or local authorities or the GLA area or a region, or are you optimizing for your country or world solutions? That these things depend on that kind of granularity, I think. So some of it is going to be about simply having better information about what's there already, and then the models of what is coming. And then where the kind of AI and data science comes in is looking at possibilities and being able to explore through models the possibilities, both of things like climate outcomes under different scenarios, but also really we should be able to test how different policy implementations might then affect urban design and urban fabric and the planning that then affect the outcomes. We need to be able to do things from the policy level, that modelling, all the way down to the effect on the ground.
A huge. Do you want to come in there?
Can I pick up on that? Yeah, because
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with all that. I think the really important thing is, it's not all about carbon capture, infrastructure investment. The latest reports are all indicating that, we've got to move fast on this stuff. And it has to be about behavioural change as well. There's got to be some behavioural adaptation. I mean, I think that is, another practical reason why we need to reach everybody, because, that kind of change, we're all in this. We've got to share that kind of message. So I think these, social and political and behavioural and human elements are hugely important.
That is a perfect way into some of our questions, actually, because the top question that we've had is, and you talked about behaviour change, Mark. Is there a place for private vehicles in the future of city centres? That's our most popular question. It's interesting, isn't it? Yes, I'm going to just go, let's say 10 years, yes or no, are we going to have, no, not 10, 20 years, are we going to still have private cars right in the middle of London?
But I think yes or no is a very tricky question there, because I think that there are people who really need some kind of transportation that they can't power themselves. And I think the vast majority of people don't. And if we have the people who don't really need it, then it's fine to have a few people with it. The problem is right now the scale of what's going on. So I mean, for me, it's not so much a yes or no question as how can we look at the vulnerable people who absolutely need some kind of transportation. What does that look like? And then find solutions that work for everyone else.
That's where you get the clash with liberty, isn't it? I mean, we were talking about the pushback on the 15-minute city.
Well, it depends whether you're talking about kind of nudge or regulation or making it advantageous or better to do something in a non-private way. A thing I always think about in this kind of circumstance is how would I get the bed back from IKEA if I don't put it in the back of the car, and or all that sort of thing. There are a lot, or if I don't have a car, how do I pick up my kids on the way home from school and things? And it's solving practical parts of people's lives that you have to do to move modes from one thing to another. And then different cities have different requirements about that. If you're somewhere like Sheffield, say, and lots of people are commuting in from the region around the city, that's a different dynamic. London's quite a different place for cars and car transport, and many more people in London don't have cars because of the density of public transport here, but that density thing really plays into that. So, it's not an easy thing to say yes or no everywhere. It's a very situational thing, I think.
And I just want to bring it because very close to me, there's been a new housing development that is going to go up. And as I understand it, I think it's 300 or 400 units, but they're not allowed parking permits from Camden. and my husband and I had a conversation about this, and we were thinking, I happen to live in an old house. Because of the way we're registered, we have 2 cars, actually, in the middle of London. But yet, maybe a younger person moving into Camden will not have the freedom that we do. That's the kind of sort of tension that I can sense might be an issue. I think it's an interesting...
Yeah.
Do we just have to live with it, live with the fact that times change?
But I mean, when you say the freedom of this, I think we also have to consider that, living in capitalism, we have a lot of things that constrain our freedom but aren't thought of that way because it's price constraints. And if we were to price the externalities into a lot of this transportation, then it would look very different in terms of who can afford it and who can't. Is that also a freedom thing? This is very much about the framing of it. And as I said, I'd like to see it being thought of in a collective and structural way so that we can think about, what makes it possible. I personally live in a city that is very, very bikeable, and I feel incredible freedom to that I didn't feel when I lived in Washington, D.C., where I didn't want to have a car, and it was very, very hard to walk or bike anywhere safely. And so the question of freedom can really mean very different things to different people.
Yeah, it is, and it's that flashpoint, isn't it? It can be a flashpoint for...
And freedoms and liberties are often seen as things you have or don't have, as opposed to things that you're trading off in some sense. What is my freedom or liberty to have cars in London versus the Tuvaluans to have a nation that's above sea level,
Or we used to think that it was very important that everyone have the freedom to smoke indoors.
Yeah.
And now we think it's more important to have the freedom to be able to breathe air that's not contaminated by carcinogens.
All I can say is
possible.
a good job that Jeremy Clarkson's not listening to this
Well,
conversation.
Maybe we'll find out later.
Can I move on to to another question here? And this is, so we've talked about kind of the problems that cities might have doing this, but actually there's a question, anonymous question that's come in. Which cities are leading the adoption of AI for good, and actually AI for positive social and environmental impact? So are there kind of symbolic cities or developments that you can name that you think actually this could be a blueprint for the way we could go? I mean, you mentioned Google Sidewalk, but...
I mean, I'm not sure at a city-wide scale, but I mean, I'll mention one example. So just before lockdown, I was at a meeting in Los Angeles, perhaps not the answer you were expecting me to give. And we had some conversations with people in local authorities and government, and they were doing some very progressive things. Again, I'm back to the question of kind of transport infrastructure. So they were thinking about, again, we go back to say, rideshare companies in particular, and they were thinking about, can we charge for urban infrastructure? So rather than allowing, again, some of these corporations to make very, very successful businesses get profits out of effectively the use of sunk infrastructure in our cities. How do we kind of counter that by developing our own business models that allow some of that investment or expenditure to flow back into future investment to greater good. So I mean, that was a really nice example of creative thinking about how you, because kind of the infrastructural thinking, how you finance all this, take it forward is a really important part of this. So I thought that was a good example.
So yeah, I was at a conference a little while ago where it was all the city innovators from across the world, and what I'm surprised about is London is quite progressive in that respect. I think Amsterdam particularly are doing some really interesting stuff.
When you say interesting stuff, what exactly is interesting about what they're doing?
So they are really, I think they're being quite pioneering with some of their approaches that they're taking. They have an algorithm register which is completely transparent to all of their cities. There's a number of different initiatives that they're undertaking using AI to understand crowd patterns. Putting me on the spot here, I can't remember all of them, but it was very impressive what some of the stuff they're talking about.
And do they have citizen buy-in for that?
Yes, so it's strange because I came from private sector and came into public sector, and one of the things that I'm doing at the moment is looking at data foundations, making sure that the data's right, making sure it's cleaned, blah, blah, blah. What you realise in public sector is one of the foundations is public trust, that you don't have to think as much about, as I'd say, in private sector. So it really is about making sure you're getting people on side and being transparent, and it relates to the autonomy question, the civil liberties question. It's about that point of being able to speak, and that's what Amsterdam have done. You could argue that they've got a bit of an advantage in that Amsterdam is one city, London is set up into lots of different boroughs, so it's a little bit more complex, and they're able to interact a little bit more. But yeah, some really impressive stuff. I think Singapore as well was really good.
Also, I think one of the important things to think about when we think about this is that AI in cities is this question of participation and this question of how we can have mechanisms that do get people's votes and consensus and buy-in. And so I think Taiwan's GovZero has been really something that's being talked about a lot.
Sorry, what was that?
Taiwan's GovZero, which is spelled G0V.
There's a lady named Audrey Tang who's very, very
quite amazing. And they've been really looking at how to use virtual sites to build consensus and finding ways, because I think this question of how do you get people to decide things in a large scale is so difficult. And we talk like, oh, once you're democratic, it's all fine. But it's actually extremely hard. And like you said, I don't think that there's any way that we can say, oh, technology is going to do this for us. I think this, as you said, going to people individually, being able to talk them through certain things is always going to be fundamental. We're always going to need a person-to-person, whether that person-to-person is mediated through screens or not. But we need humans to be very engaged in this. But technology can help with some of the parts of, amalgamating votes and looking at, minute differences that can come into consensus and some of these areas. And I think there's really interesting work being done in those areas and in some places.
I want to pick up some really good questions coming in, so thank you very much for everyone who's asked them. There's one from Matthew. Technology and AI-centric companies like Airbnb and others are already shaping our cities. I am thinking of Camden here because it's always in our local newspaper because there's council housing stock which are now rented out by the day. What guardrails do you see the need for to limit their influence?
I think in areas like that, there's a certain level at which a local authority can help and a certain area where you can't. I think a great parallel is the recent implementation of ChatGPT into all the Microsoft products, right? So there's no companies deciding that they're going to use AI. There's no regulation that they're going to do. It's just going to be rolled out and it's going to be pervasive within all of the productivity tools that you have. I'm not sure if you can checkbox it on or not, but essentially it's going to be there. And there are going to be these waves and forces that we will have to accommodate. You can't control everything. The function, I can talk about local government, the function of local government is to look after its community, safeguard its citizens' data, and make sure that the interests of the residents are put first, and use our networks and resources and capability in order to do that. It's one of those things where we've just got to make sure that we're keeping that human, citizen-centred approach at the front of mind.
I think guardrail to me feels like a nice word for regulation, doesn't it? I don't know, but I think you have to understand what harms you're trying to prevent or what benefits you're trying to incur from these technologies coming in, and then you have to be able to monitor what is the effect of this usually private sector technology coming in, and so that you can decide whether those harms are occurring or whether you're getting the benefits that you thought you were going to get from this, and hence develop any regulation or incentives that are needed to shift that. So it comes down to knowing what your intention is, I think.
Okay.
I think picking up on that point about knowing what your intention is. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, I was thinking about this when we were talking before about your example of banning cars in certain parts of Camden or whatever. But it seems to me that as a society, almost as a world, we've lost an interest in strategic planning. Everything that we're thinking about, you talk about regulation or it's immediate action to stop something immediate happening. You need a much stronger picture of where do we want to get to. If we're going to have a net zero city in 2035 or 2050 or what have you, we've got to conceive what that looks like and try and work towards it.
So who is thinking strategically about what cities are going to look like? I mean, I don't know.
So what I would say is there's a kind of implication here that there's an adversarial relationship between public and private sector, which I don't think is actually as prevalent as possibly it's made out to be. When you talk about strategic, you're talking about the outcomes. A lot of the times you can align outcomes from private and public partnership, and we do that all the time, trying to make sure that we are kind of aiming towards the same thing. And there's lots of. I'll give you an example. For example, tomorrow I'm going to the Wellcome Trust, where we're talking about digital inclusion, where we're talking with 150 companies that are specifically around in our borough, talking about how we can all work together towards addressing some of these challenges. Yeah. And that sort of participatory, not just participatory with your citizens, but also the businesses and the private sector organisations.
And there's potentially business benefit in that as well. If you look at the number of, say, delivery companies and delivery hubs and vans and bikes around in a neighbourhood, there is a potential for efficiency there by having collective hubs and so on as well. And there are potential ways to work with companies about net efficiency for everyone. Yeah.
And can I fold in a point that's made by Mariam, who was asking, what's the role of the property development industry in this? Are they on these strategic boards, panels, discussion groups, or not? And what role do they play, if so?
Not sure about their inclusion, but the property development companies have been having to think about where does particularly the commercial property sector go now, and that is post-pandemic as much as anything. The huge shifts in working and so on are forcing a lot of those companies to think about that future and that future of cities, if you like, and the future of need of both commercial and kind of private property. So it is on those companies' agendas, that kind of thing.
And I would just add that, yes, there is a lot of participatory work with private, property developers. There's also one of the biggest levers that public sector has is around their procurement. These, public sector has a huge amount of money that they spend with these organisations. And so so we've built in, and lots of public sector organisations have done this now, built in a certain element of social value that all private sector organisations have to deliver if they are going to be able to work and interact with us. And this is something that these organisations, by and large, are happily doing. So I think, as I say, I'm not convinced that it is as adversarial a relationship, and we are all working together towards certain goals.
It's interesting you say that, because I mean I've heard counter arguments in the city of Leeds where people people who work in the housing department, for example, and they're saying, okay, we need more of a certain kind of housing, more accessible to disadvantaged groups or what have you, and they just can't get developers to.
Oh, really?
Because they say, oh, that doesn't fit our business model, quote unquote. You can unpack that for yourself. So I mean, I think there are potentially tensions.
And I think it's to your point, all these places are different, right? I'm talking about London Borough, you're talking about Leeds. It just illustrates the complexity of the challenges that we face. Yes. There's not simple solutions across all of these.
I want to take two last questions because they cover important aspects. One is an anonymous questioner says, a panellist said UK cities and infrastructure are already built. I disagree. We have an acute housing crisis. Few cities have a metro. Can AI help to solve this crisis? I'm actually particularly thinking about homelessness, which is an issue in Camden and central London generally. Homelessness. So Malka, I know this is a big question. We don't have perfect cities, but actually we don't even have, for a lot of people, cities don't serve their existing needs.
Yes, I agree completely. And I also think, from, again, my other jacket, to say the city planning is done here is thinking that there's not going to be any catastrophic disasters in the future of whatever kind. And, a lot of my experience with participatory city planning comes from working in Japan in the aftermath of the tsunami of 2011, when a lot of small cities and towns had to almost completely rebuild and figure out how to do that process with, I hope nothing like that happens, but to imagine that we're done is a bit, I think, short-sighted. And we should also, I think, just to very quickly add a temporal perspective, even without looking at something catastrophic, we tend to think of cities as somehow immobile. And I think there's also a resistance to change among a lot of people who feel very strong emotional attachment to their neighborhood or their place, which is normal, but also it's fundamentally normal for cities and neighborhoods to evolve and change. And if you look at the places that are very poor now or very rich, they have not always been that way. This shifts very rapidly. Infrastructure that is designed to last for 50 years often is outdated within 10. And so we need to also consider that these are, as has been said of cities, movable feasts, that they change very rapidly, and be ready to work with that change.
I think it was very interesting, actually. One of the questions that's come in is about the changing nature of work, and more people are working from home, which kind of has given a lot of us a kind of different relationship with our neighbourhood. And I was very interested to read, I think, that suburban sort of places were becoming quite popular because people didn't mind travelling 2 or 3 days a week into town. but it gave them more access to the countryside. Another question we had was about surveillance, and actually this is a really important question because again it pushes back a bit on the social attitudes towards AI and data. Are we all just going to be surveilled all the time in the city of the future that is running on AI and data science?
I think it depends whether you mean, am I being surveilled all the time, or are we being modelled as part of an understanding of the dynamics of the system? And that comes down to kind of data policy and data regulation. In the geospatial sector, there's a thing called the Locus Charter that describes kind of principles of fair and good use of geographic information about people, for example. And what it comes down to, that is either regulation or companies being socially minded to sign up to charters like that. It will, again, these things are about trade-offs, aren't they? And yes, you probably don't want to be surveilled from the moment you get up. That city of the future, the moment you get up and turn the shower on and your electricity kind of spikes and you get in your autonomous vehicle and then you interact with the Internet of Things in the building you're working in, and the CO2 monitor in your room that controls the windows detects whether you're in the room or not. Yeah, that could happen. But that's about our collected purpose for these things and what benefits we're getting, and how does that trade off against data. That personal data is valuable, on the other hand, for actually better design of our systems and knowing where you need to put more bus routes in because there are people waiting too long and so on. So these things are about trade-off and protection, aren't they?
Malka?
Yeah, I just want to say, if we're concerned about whether we're going to be able to have private vehicles in the city, what makes us think that we're going to spend the electricity on the enormous servers required to keep that amount of data?
Yeah.
So I think right now we see surveillance going in a certain direction. It's easy to imagine that it always will, but there are costs to that right now I think are being underestimated. And it's something to consider, that perhaps storage of data and analysis of this data is not always going to be something that's feasible economically or environmentally.
We need a whole other city for the servers.
I think surveillance is an interesting term, isn't it? It's very, very loaded. And I just think that if we're so against it, why do we spend so much time submitting ourselves to voluntary surveillance? I mean, Jeremy, you kind of, I'm thinking about store loyalty cards, that kind of thing, where for very small benefits, we seem perfectly happy to buy into the idea that a mobile phone company or a retailer has all kinds of data around us. But then it almost seems to me you flip that around and say, well, I'd like to use that for some kind of public good, and people say, oh, that's surveillance. You don't want to be doing that. That's awful. I worry that we've got things completely the wrong way around almost.
That illustrates a perfect point. So what I was going to say is, I would argue that we are already being surveilled to a high degree in the private sector. Or looking at it from a private sector point of view, we can find out, Google and lots of these other organizations have a huge amount of data around you, from everything that you search through to the wearables, biometric data, all sorts of things. And using predictive modeling, they can not just talk about what you know now, but what they think you're going to know what they think you're going to do in the future. However, when we talk about public sector, we are held to a different standard, and we are accountable to our citizens, and so it's the challenge that we've got, which is we can't as much as I'd love to say that oh well, you're being surveyed in the private sector, why isn't it why is it any different? And every single study you ever see will show you that actually people are more than willing to give away their private data if it's exchanged for some sort of value. So the old adage of, if you're getting a product for free, the chances are the product, if you're getting something for free, the chances are the product, you are the product, right? So that's the reason that people are doing it. And that's the difficulties.
Malka, can I ask you to wrap up just with, there was a really good question actually, which I'd missed, but actually I think we should ask. And I think you would be the person to answer. How do we ensure that AI adapts to the way we want to live and that we do live, rather than making us adapt to it?
Well, I think at this point, at least, we're really not talking about us adapting to AI. We're talking about us adapting to the products that are being designed by large companies that they are calling AI and that has some varying elements of machine learning, but we're not talking about some kind of independent entity at this point, as I understand it. And so we really need to be thinking about whether it's through regulation, whether it's through actually folding in externalities and other incentives, whether it's through just, I don't know, somehow devaluing the enormous power that these companies have, and human-centering what we build, and really thinking about the products that we're putting into the world. We are looking at very limited resources in our planet across a whole different range of resources that we use, and compared to the number of people that we are dealing with. And so thinking about what we do with those resources at this point should be already something in the forefront of our mind.
So it's stewardship. How are we going to steward these?
Stewardship, but also priorities and values. And we should be thinking, as you said, of a vision of what the cities of the future that we want, and making sure that we aim for that.
Fantastic, and that's a really good point at which to end. So thank you very much to our panel. I'm just going to say that we're going to be back in about 10 minutes for a conversation on biodiversity and AI. But first of all, I would love you to give a big thanks to our fantastic panel.